So, John, it's great to be here with you today, talking about this book that I absolutely love, the running book. Thank you for sending this to me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Here's my copy. They're doing a little wave to each other.
But I have to say, I'm going to be completely honest with you. When this arrived, I was a bit like, a book about running in Ireland, not the most obvious thing for an author to send to me personally, although I do run, but I don't think you would have even known that. So I was quite intrigued more than anything as to why you thought this naturally fit with my world. But actually, I have to say, I absolutely love this book, and I completely get why you sent it to me now, having read it.
Yeah, I must confess to having discovered you online, and I was like, oh, this is the sort of person that needs to see this book. And yeah, it was really it's kind of like Afua. It was a gamble to write. Like I had published the cow book and it had been quite a success, but I had said to my friend, who the book is dedicated to, Stephen Ray, that I had wanted to write a book about colonialism and post-colonialism, but also talk about running. And it was strange. It was only, I was in Spain trying to start the book, and then I started watching a couple of documentaries. And I always think, it's funny, there's a thing that I kind of follow when I'm working on a project, and maybe you do too. It's kind of the magnetism of a book or a project that starts bringing things into your field of vision that at another time wouldn't make any sense. But I was watching a documentary called After Silence about W.G. Sebald and the Rings of Saturn. And then I also had watched Adam Curtis's documentaries, The Power of Nightmares, and he makes these great documentaries for the BBC. And I started to realize that there could be you could write on the face of it a book about a run, but really a book about race and politics and the British Empire. And
I love that. It's such an original way to talk about our history, narratives, identities. But I want to start with the running, because I am completely intimidated by you as a runner. So I go for like 5-6K runs in the morning where I live on the common, which is beautiful.
oh,
And
that's
it's a form of like meditation, starting my day right. It just
yeah.
sets me up, gets the serotonin release. But when I was reading your book, you said, yeah, I'm a bit slow to get warmed up. I usually start getting warmed up around the 5-6K mark. And I was like, okay, that's when I'm done. That's when you're warmed up. Your runs are like, they are literally marathons, and that seems to be what you do.
Yeah, like it's it all started, and I talk about this in the book, and it's funny that in Ireland here the media have focused on the mental health aspect of the book and not so much about the colonialism, but it started from a negative space for me where I was dealing with some mental health problems, and running sort of came as this panacea. But yeah, it's kind of it's funny, particularly with the lockdowns. We had the 5K radiuses here. The road kind of became my office, and I was talking to people as I was out running for long periods of time, and I really enjoy it. I suppose it's kind of it's not only meditative and good for your health, but it allows me to make sense of the day. And there's a guy in the book who I talk about, Dr. George Sheehan, who I never met the guy or anything, but I thought what he said was fantastic. He said you should make every day your masterpiece, and that the great event is today. And I thought, if we could all think like that, the great event, no one is going to come along and present you and go, my Lord, like today is the day, you're going to run 6K. It's like, well, actually, this is it. I'm going to make today count. And that's kind of a philosophy I've followed. And during the lockdown, I went down a river on a canoe, and I was saying this to a friend of mine who's a British journalist who was with me. I said, making the day count, really, it is just the intention of a 5K run, or for me, I'd run maybe 10K every day, and then longer runs once or twice a week. And I suppose it's a way of taking a moment out of time for yourself to enjoy yourself. And I was writing about silence today, about how it can be a pleasurable thing, but I think in running, it's the same thing. We're coming to meet ourselves and taking a moment in the day that is just ours. It's not anyone else's. So yeah, running for me has kind of been a church and a way of understanding the world.
And you're not, as you were saying, using running for its own sake in this book as a storytelling device. It's a journey through the past as it lives and breathes and affects the land and the people who live in it, including you in your story. I loved the way in which you talk about your community, because for anyone who hasn't read this book, you live in is it a village?
Yeah.
You live in a village, and you know not only the people in the village, but the previous generations of people who lived in the village and the stories of their ancestors, and the families go back a long way. And for someone like me who lives in London, and you know, all my ancestors come from somewhere completely different, I just was so besotted with this idea of being so grounded in a place that you've been descended alongside everyone else's lineages. Like, it seemed really deep, and then you tell that story whilst also telling the story really of British colonialism in Ireland and how that has affected not just the country but people's really personal stories. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, I suppose, you know, I talk it's funny, I'll tell you about that, but what I was going to say was, growing up, I wouldn't have appreciated that lineage and that people can be rooted in a place. And I think it was only in emigrating and living in other places and essentially living in big cities where no one is fixed to any particular place, that when I came back, I appreciated it and appreciated this fixing of people to places. What was it you were asking me about the colonial?
Yeah, so kind of give us the introduction to the colonial story that affects you and your place and your people.
Yeah, so I suppose, you know, it's funny, a friend said to me once, you can't tell the story of Ireland without mentioning the British, but you can tell the story of Britain and never mention the Irish. And it's kind of for me, I wanted to, there's a lot of history books that have been wrote about this time, but not ones that have focused down on place and story. And in a sense, what I wanted to do was talk about one place and show that in the local was the universal, that actually this isn't everywhere, that that there is a link between the colonial experience as lived in my small neighborhood as there is to someone who lives in Australia or parts of Britain or in America. And I suppose what I wanted to do was talk about the colonial experience and the post-colonial experience. And it all tied around a weird thing, actually. I was in Spain and I was watching an online mass, and the priest said this amazing line, which I put in the book. He said, like the disciples seeing Christ after Easter, we must make peace with our scars. And I thought, I'm not a big Holy Joe, but I thought it was really interesting because ultimately the place that we all look to, Britain, for this acknowledgement and eventual admission of wrongdoing, they're never going to do that. So we have to come to peace with our own scars ourselves. And, you know, it's an interesting thing, like a hero of mine, Shashi Tharoor, the former UN Secretary General, he wrote a book, Inglorious Empire, about Britain's role in India. And, you know, he kind of a hero of mine, and he kind of raised the issue. And yet the book didn't cause a buzz in Britain the way it did in India, because there are certain sections of society that, you know, don't want to refer to that time or talk about that time. And in talking about it and understanding it, I think we can gain an insight. And I suppose for me, having lived in countries that were all former colonies of Britain, from Australia to Canada to America, I wanted to link up by just going on a run in a short 40 mile radius, or 40-kilometer radius, 42-kilometer radius, to show the links that the empire has to all of these places. And I suppose for me, it became so interesting because the first place in the village was a neighbor who ended up controlling 64,000 acres of Australia, and you know, was an Anglo-Irish, his family are still there, was an Anglo-Irish figure who was involved in some very bad things in Australia, and led to the colonization of vast tracts of that country. But also in exploring that, I realized that the Irish are not just victims in colonialism. We also took part in the project. And so that was something that I suppose I had to come to face with myself, in a sense, because we have a narrative that we suffered, and that was it. But we also took part. So yeah, it's been interesting.
I found that fascinating. You really build up the scale of the atrocities that were committed on Ireland by Britain, but then you also say, but then Irish people who went to America, for example, took part in the genocide of Native Americans. And it's that nuance there it's complicated, and it's not black and white, that victims become perpetrators and the oppressed become oppressors. But just on the British colonial experience, one thing that I really took from this book, which I hadn't really conceived of in the same way before, was that Britain kind of practiced some of its colonial playbook on Ireland. So the things that Britain would later do all over the world, Ireland was often the first place that it practiced those techniques. It was the land appropriation or massacres. And it was just so interesting to realize that what happened in Ireland so directly affects the story of colonialism elsewhere, because it was the first one.
I remember there's a film essayist, Pat Collins, here in Ireland, whose work is just fantastic. But he did a film called "What We Leave in Our Wake," a film essay, and in it there was figures talking about it, how Ireland was the great laboratory of Britain, that they could carry out experiments here that essentially could we can see if they work, and I suppose the famine is, the 0 hour greatest experiment and failure of experiment, in that we will let the market fix things. We will let, we're not going to be generous or provide charity because it's up to people to fix it themselves. And, ultimately that experiment totally failed and millions of people died. But then, as you say, like the experiments that occurred, you have chattel slavery or indentured servitude, and I'm being very careful about how I say that. There was the Irish who Cromwell sent to America, and most of them were indentured slaves. But of course, that narrative has been totally changed in America now by certain groups who say, well, the Irish were slaves and we don't complain about it, and that opens up this whole can of worms, which is, it's not the experience of enslaved African people, but people who are forcibly removed from the land. So it's a really, it's when and it goes back to the thing when you try and analyze the history, you just can't imagine what Ireland would be like. I'm speaking to you in the language that we opted to learn and speak in. We gave up, essentially, around the 1700s, 1800s, people forcibly stopped speaking Irish and started speaking English as a way to get ahead in the world. But there's very few countries where the people just stopped. It does exist in certain regions in the country, but essentially people stopped. So we engaged. We were engaged by this colonial experiment, and I think the results are still there to be seen in Northern Ireland. It's still happening. The issue of the experiment of the North was the plantation of British settlers, which has resulted in the conflict that you and I have known all our lives in Northern Ireland. It's planted people, and you know, it's kind of, I suppose we see it in various countries where when Britain went in, they put a minority in power of a majority, and so often it turned into violence, particularly in the in the period post-independence for these countries. So I always think of, you know, as well of Sykes-Picot in the Middle East, and, you know, these arbitrary lines in the sand, and said, okay, you're now you're now an Iraqi, you know, or
and
you're
the whole
Syrian.
of the African continent, which was literally a series of lines drawn up.
Exactly.
By
And
a group of Europeans, totally,
yeah, and
most of whom had never set foot on the African continents. There was
yes,
no.
there was more known about. They said there was more known about the moon than there was about the interior of Africa. And interestingly, I'm still uncovering figures. I was writing the final book in this memoir trilogy, and I was writing about a figure, an Irishman, Major Houghton, who the Africa Association was formed by a group of British explorers, essentially in the 1700s, and he was sent up the Niger River up to the Gambia to find Timbuktu. And it was, on the face of it, was supposed to be, you know, scientific exploration, but really everywhere they went, they were setting up slave trading posts. And then and Joseph Banks had been involved in it, who was, you know, the man who helped discover Australia. And the line that stuck with me, they said, was, well, if we make money along the way, that's okay. You know, it's just like, there's no scientific experiment here or geographic experiment. It's like, you're here to make money and explore and take from the continent, you know. And I think that, and again, that's an Irish figure. And I said to my friend at the time, we like to remember the rebels, but we don't like to remember those figures. And we have a job to remember those figures too. So.
Yeah. And, you know, I, as you said, followed and was affected by, like every British person, what has happened in Northern Ireland growing up. But reading your book, it was another reminder that in Britain, you learn none of this in school. You learn nothing about British colonization of Ireland. You learn nothing even about the Troubles. We learned about Northern Ireland from the news, not from any attempt to really explain the roots of the conflict or how power and identity was arranged there deliberately by Britain. So it just really strikes me as a huge, you know, and it's one thing that we don't learn anything about Britain's colonial history in Africa, in India, or elsewhere in the world. But it's another when it's so close to home that, you know, this is now part of the United Kingdom and the nation with which we share a land border, and we don't learn anything about it, no matter, though it's so close and such a relevant and present part of our daily lives.
Yeah, I think it's you know, it's an interesting thing. I'm reminded of when I was in Australia, and I lived there for about 6 years. There was a concept that started called the History Wars, where Aboriginal people wanted the history of colonization to be taught in the history curriculum, and the then Prime Minister of the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, said that this was a black armband view of history, and why would we talk about this? So essentially, the books in Australia start with well, there was Aboriginal people who lived here, and then in 17 whatever the British came, and that's it, and it was all peaceful. And I think the term history wars is just a really essential thing, because we are not taught about the correct history of certain things. And I suppose that's where I go back to Adam Curtis. He talked about, in The Power of Nightmares, he talked about constructing the narrative after World War II. They constructed the narrative of the history of it to say, well, this is really what it was about. But at the time, you know, people didn't fully understand. The Holocaust hadn't actually been fully realized till much later in the war. So it wasn't a war about freedom. It was a war about stopping German expansionism at the time. But to go back to what you were saying, yeah, I think that so often we are not taught enough about each other's lands. And for me, I will say too, there was a reluctance in our history books to talk about the Troubles in the North as well. And it was something that I had to discover. And I remember having the conversation with my parents saying, well, what happened to the people in the North, and why aren't we helping them? And, you know, there was a very awkward silence. They were saying, well, you know, it's part of Britain, and there are people who identify as nationalists there, but it's not part of Ireland. And it's a really, I think, of all the regions in the British Isles, I think that Northern Ireland is the one that causes the most confusion, because there's so many different narratives over it, and we don't want to deny anyone's Britishness or Irishness in those things. And I think Seamus Heaney said it really well. He said in his book of essays, he talked about Britain's Ireland and Ireland's Ireland. And actually there really is two Irelands. You know, there's the Britain that exists, or there's the Ireland that exists in Britain. And really that narrative is largely looked at as the big brother to the little brother. Well, you know, they're good little people. And I think that, you know, we still have a lot to learn between the two islands about the stories that occurred in both places. And oftentimes the story is not a good one, you know. But a little bit like, I'm reminded, you know, of, again, Britain not knowing its stories. You know, we had the Windrush scandal last year, 2 years ago, and most white British people weren't aware. You know, they didn't actually know about this story, which was the foundation of the Caribbean people in Britain. You know, and it's like,
as well as the foundation of our National Health Service, our public transport system, and it's kind of hidden in plain sight that people live alongside this legacy but just didn't know where it came from, understood nothing about it. And actually, I'm glad you bring up Windrush, because I want to ask you about race, because you position yourself as a white man in this book and the way you talk about it. And I have always, you know, before I really had studied race or understood it, always was aware of the Irish as a kind of phenomenon that didn't fit very easily into narratives of race. And, you know, in the Windrush era, the famous signs, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs, that the blacks and the Irish were somehow racialized together in this group of people who were other and non-white. And then studying race and understanding that Irish people were assimilated into whiteness during the 20th century, that, you know, at the beginning of the 20th century, many Irish people were not regarded by British people as white, or as occupying the kind of Anglo-Saxon purity that kind of imperial Britishness valued. And I just think it's a fascinating story of how race is a social construct, so can shift and change over time. But I'm just always interested in how Irish people feel about your own identity and how that sits with the ways in which we think about the history of race and race now.
Yeah, I think it's a huge question. And, you know, a few people have said to me, because I talk a lot about Indigenous peoples, and they say, well, do you see yourself as Indigenous? And I said, well, yes, I'm Indigenous to this land, you know, but I suppose I feel a great akinness to Indigenous people because I worked with them as a journalist, whether it was Aboriginal Australians or Aboriginal Canadians or Native Americans. But it was because it was essentially a similar experience of land dispossession, disenfranchisement, and then a growth of rebellion or independence, and then a movement towards civil rights. And we also have to remember that it's really interesting because the black and white experience are tied in together. And I think Northern Ireland's a great place to talk about that, because if the civil rights movement hadn't started in America with African Americans, the civil rights movement wouldn't have started in Northern Ireland. They were directly inspired by the African American experience. And in Northern Ireland, there was the one man, one vote campaign. People were actually campaigning to have civil liberties. And I think the notion of whiteness, you're so right. We were not included as white people. I often think of the Punch cartoons, which depicted the Irish as apes, similarly as African people were depicted as apes. And David Ireland wrote a play which was on in London last year called Cypress Avenue, and there's a fascinating conversation between the main actor, who's a Protestant Northern Irish person, and his psychologist, who is a black English woman. And she says, you know, your people are depicted as loud and musical and as apes. And she says, yeah, but so are yours. You know, it's just, and he's a racist in the play. And when he comes to realize that, like, he's like, and it's just this brilliant writing. And you're just like, yeah, it's exactly the same thing. But somewhere, I think, along the line, that the whiteness that was bestowed upon us, it wasn't a WASP experience. We somehow got integrated into the community. We also maybe forgot some of our obligations from when we were outsiders. And I think that the Irish society can be quite insular now, whereas before, when we were in the Commonwealth, we were campaigning a lot on rights of other nations. And I think that it's a fascinating conversation of intersectionality. And I myself, my wife's Vietnamese Australian, so we're hoping to have kids next year. So they're going to be completely in that intersection of, well, you're Irish, you're also Australian, but you're Vietnamese, but you're going to be living in Ireland and learning this particular history. So, but also her own history is one of dispossession as well. So it's just kind of a really, I think that the modern world makes for far better questions about this stuff. But I think that, the Black and Irish experience, there's so many links and so much to talk about. At the same time, when we went to America, the draft riots that happened in New York, the Irish did attack the African American community, and there was lynchings. So I think that it's also a history that is quite dark. And I think because there's a race, because we were all at the bottom, which can happen, we turned on each other. And it's kind of a sad, well, it's not kind of, it is a sad thing to remark upon. But it's so it's a book that was a gamble, Afua, and I suppose ultimately it all does tie back to that thing of healing the wounds of the past. And I think that ultimately, as post-colonial people, whatever that is, I'm actually not sure what a post-colonial person is. I don't think anyone knows what that is.
I was going to say, when you find out, let me know.
Yeah, but I think that it's a conversation that will continually happen, and I think that it has to happen in Britain all the time. You know, I was reminded Steve McQueen obviously has Small Axe, the show out now, and it's another voice on another thing that we didn't know about. And you know, it's I think as people in the arts and academia, that it's our job to ask these questions and hopefully get answers. I remember the last thing I'll tell you is, when I was writing the book, I was out for lunch at a Malaysian restaurant near the British Library, and there was a Ethiopian man and a Iraqi man sitting beside me and my wife, and they were having a conversation about the British Empire, and it was exactly the conversation of my book. And I turned around to him and I was like, have you been listening to us talk? And he said, no, we're just having our own conversation. And it just erupted. The four of us ended up talking about the British Empire, and it was what amazed me. I was like, okay, so it's the exact same conversation in Ethiopia as it is in Ireland. And it was just the world felt really small that day, and kind of amazing, actually.
That's how I felt reading your book. And so just to finish with your book, I never thought that I would feel like I could relate so much to a story about rural Ireland, but I related to this in so many ways and learned a lot from it. And now it's set me on a journey of wanting to understand more about Irish history and British colonialism in Ireland, and Irishness as an identity, and how it was assimilated into whiteness and all these things, which I just think are endlessly fascinating, as well as very important to know. So thank you for writing this. I cannot recommend it enough. I want everybody to read this book. It's such a joy. I've already given it to lots of my friends to read. You can see it's like being passed around.
Oh, good. That's great.
So it's also lovely, just lovely, because it sounds like such a beautiful part of the world where you live. And I will never run that kind of distance, but it did for like a split second make me think I would love to.
Oh, that's all that matters. People tell me they'll want to go for a run after they read the book, so that's always good. All right, Afua.
You know, it's cold and dark and wet.
I know.
And you still get out there and hit the road, so it's inspiring
it.
on that level.
Okay.
Thank you, John. It was really fun talking to you.
Thank you, Afua. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.